Good morning. Well, today is Juneteenth. It is a national holiday as of 2 years ago, and I must confess that for many years of my life I had no idea what Juneteenth was all about. In fact, it wasn't until the mid 1970s when I moved to Texas that I even heard the term. And back then, the celebration was pretty much limited to just the black communities, some vague celebration of freedom, but I didn't really know much else. It was only much more recently that I truly understand the significance of this day. It's a day that remembers that on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, in essence, freeing all of the slaves. But that word didn't get out. It didn't spread to all of the states where slaves were being held. And it wasn't until June the 19th, 1865, 2.5 years later, that a small contingent of Union troops under the direction of Major General Granger landed in Galveston, Texas, and proclaimed to those slaves that you are indeed free. For 2.5 years they had labored in slavery, not knowing that they were actually free. This idea of a proclamation of freedom was not new to Abraham Lincoln. It was something that Jesus initiated at the very beginning of his ministry. He began in his hometown of Nazareth. He stood up in the synagogue and he read from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He quoted these words from Isaiah chapter 61. The Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. Jesus proclaimed that he was here to proclaim freedom for the captives. And a little later on, he gives more information. In John chapter 8, he says, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Well, what was that truth? The truth was that God loved his people so much that he would send his own son as a sacrifice to pay the price for our sins, to reestablish relationship, and to free us from the bondage of sin. But unless we know about that proclamation, we still labor in sin. Paul understood that even if we know that proclamation, sometimes we'll misuse it. In fact, in Galatians chapter 5, he says, for you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use that freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. Wait a minute, we become free so that we can become slaves to one another? One is captive through no choice. The other is choosing to be a slave for the benefit of others. In 1948, the United Nations, when they were conceived after the Holocaust of the World War II, put out a declaration. It was called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the first article of that declaration said, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. We're endowed with reason, the ability to understand the truth, and conscience, the understanding that we should be compassionate as we execute the truth, and we should do it in a spirit of brotherhood. That is the spirit that Paul was talking to the Galatians about, is the spirit that Jesus was proclaiming. There's one final story about Juneteenth that I think is interesting. It is true that Granger landed with some troops and proclaimed the emancipation of the slaves. But what is not widely known is that he stayed in Galveston for about 6 months. Because you see, once these slaves were freed, the question was, what are they going to do? And so he helped to put together trade agreements between the former slaveholders and the former slaves. What came out of that was many of those slaves, former slaves, continued to serve their former masters, but now under a new set of rules. Now there was governance. Now they had rights. Now they had the ability to make a decision as to whether or not they were going to serve. And many of them stayed exactly where they were. You see, we are called still to be slaves, but to choose to do it under a new set of rules, the rules of loving our neighbor as ourselves. On this particular day, on this particular Juneteenth, let's remember the significance of the freedom that we all share in Jesus Christ, and let's serve one another as a result. Have a great week.